You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings, and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is September 1st, 2020, and we're going to have David Collis on the show. David Collis is a native of Southern California, is driven by the romance of quests, exploration, and invention. He is captivated by art, architecture, craft, religion, and the humanities. His diverse talents are rich as his experiences. He's traveled the world, made pilgrimages to holy sites, built a stone energy circle and labyrinth, conducted a vision quest, explored alternative healing, learned the hidden language of dreams, investigated the religions of the world, lectured on the Gospel of Thomas, and created a new series of sacred symbols he says are original symbols for the new era. David can be reached at www.davidcollis.com. That's DAVIDCOLLIS.com. And you can also find him on Facebook. So we're going to get right into it. He has written a book called Interviewing Jesus, the Man. It's his first book. And we're just going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll be right back with him on Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. We're with David Collis. He's the author of Interviewing Jesus, the Man. David, how are you today?
I'm excellent.
Awesome, man. It sure is. It's great to have you on. We've got a ton of questions about this book. Do you want to tell us first off what it is, what it's about?
Yeah, my book, in a summation, is my attempt to explore Jesus' humanity through his actions and his words. And I was interested in trying to understand where his wisdom came from, what inspired him, and why he did what he did. And I tried to look at it from a non-theological perspective.
All right, and I suppose what was the hardest part about writing it?
Well, it was doing all the research, and part of my research had to explore Greek history, Roman history, Egyptian history. I had to look at the religions of the Mediterranean. I had to look at the kind of world religions, and I had to look at the historical context that Jesus lived in. And all of that took a lot of time for me to, at least, I'm not going to say that I understand it 100%, but it was enough to be able to start looking at Jesus from the perspective of what was going on in this particular region. And so that just took a long time to kind of plow through a lot of the material that I did.
Can I ask you what kind of religious upbringing you had?
Oh, it was primarily Christian, and I spent a lot of time in Christianity. And with Christianity, I saw it from different points of view. So I saw it from a traditional perspective. I saw it from a Protestant perspective. I explored the Christian mystics that you would find with the Catholics. So there'd be St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila and the types like that. And then I also looked at the historical development of Christianity, and I also spent some time trying to understand the Gnostics, because Gnosticism was also part of the early Christian movement. In fact, it was part of the Christian movement until it was considered a heresy, and it was banned and it was illegal, and that occurred in the 4th century.
And who did that?
That was finally kind of the Church of Rome, with the Nicene Creed and Constantine.
So
we're looking around 325.
They just made it illegal?
Yeah. Once you get an official accreditation from the Romans, if there were any things that were kind of outside of that boundary, then they considered that heretical. So there was a legal dimension to the official Christianity. So anything outside of that now then became something that Rome didn't recognize, and as such, they considered it heretical.
Now, you wrote this book. I honestly haven't read it, but you wrote this book in an interview form, whereas you're kind of writing it like you're talking to Jesus himself, like it's an interview with Jesus, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, the it was interesting. I was very interested in the idea of a dialogue, and I felt that I was more comfortable creating dialogue than I was trying to create, a thesis and an argument. So, and I felt like that wasn't going to do any justice. So I felt like this concept that there was, somebody I was talking to and having a conversation back and forth started to really intrigue me. And part of that paradigm is what Plato was involved in, because he would love to ask questions and then have a response. And I felt like I really wanted to kind of have the same type of format.
So how long did it take you to write the book? Like once you started it. Now I'm not
I,
asking about your research, but like once you started it and you got going, how easily was it able to flow through you?
there was most of the book flowed fairly quickly, so that took like 4 months. And then there was a moment where I realized I didn't have an ending to the book, and I didn't fully understand and appreciate how to conclude it. And so I spent some time really contemplating the nature of the end of the book. And the way that I started off writing the book, I wanted to get some historical background before Jesus started his ministry, and then I wanted to break it up into his ministry. And in between there was a bridge, which was the John the Baptist chapter. So that bridged me between Jesus, who was, the one who no one really knew about but was hoping for, and then John, and then we went into his ministry. And I decided at that point that I wanted to follow a little bit of the Gospels in that. So I kind of followed down that road. And then when it got to his crucifixion, I realized that everything that I was seeing during that particular period of Jesus's ministry and his life was from somebody else's perspective. It was from the Christian's perspective. And so I really wasn't able to penetrate into why Jesus was doing this except through the theological perspective. So I spent a lot of time contemplating that particular aspect of Jesus's life. And it finally dawned on me, and I asked the simple question, I know what the death of Jesus meant to the Christians, but what did Jesus' death mean to Jesus himself? And with that seemed to open up the door for me to explore that particular part of the book and that particular type of part of his life.
Can you give us some examples of questions you asked Jesus in the book?
I would ask, if well, first of all, I had to determine, and I ended up making a lot of charts and using Excel spreadsheets for this, but I had to ask myself questions like, what did Jesus know before he started his ministry, and what did he learn while he was on the job? So questions started to relate around that particular dynamic. Did Jesus know the Father before he went to John the Baptist? And if you said, yes, he did know the Father before he went to John the Baptist, then what's the point of going to get baptized? That's somebody else's right. That's not Jesus's right. So there had to have been something that was motivating Jesus to go to John the Baptist, other than at least for as I was concerned, than what the Christians were saying, that, he had to go to John the Baptist to get baptized so that he can get the Holy Spirit. Well, that didn't make sense to me, because if you really think about the logic of it, if you say that God is fullness and complete fullness, God can't add more to himself and become more God, and God can't divest of himself and become less God. He is fully God. So how could Jesus go to John the Baptist and then get baptized and then be filled with the Holy Spirit. That didn't make sense to me on a logical level.
Yeah,
Because
there's a lot of religions that say that being baptized is how you are forgiven of the sin of being born, because being born is actually a sin. And
that's an interesting point of view. Yeah,
since he was
right.
born a human, he had committed that sin, so he had to be baptized to be forgiven for it.
Yeah, I don't know if I would agree. Obviously, I'm not going to be in agreement of that kind of idea that somehow the world is inherently evil, and by being born, you're born into evil, or that you've committed some type of sin. I know that that's the way the Christians like to think of it, but I just find that that's a very difficult idea to
So you think
embrace and
so you're
and accept.
saying that baptism is a what are you saying that baptism is? You're being filled with
Well,
the Holy Spirit?
Well, in the gospel stories, it's not until Jesus is baptized by John that the dove, the Holy Spirit, comes to Jesus and fills him and says, "You are my son." So the the philosophical question that I asked was, if you are God, how come you can be filled with God since you're already God? And the logic is that God can't fill himself with himself to become more God, nor can God become less God by giving himself up. So I found that was a bit of a problem for me. So I had to try to come to terms with that.
Yeah. So what did you learn through all of the research? What did you learn about Jesus? You I guess I guess what I'm trying to say is you you don't think that Jesus is actually like a son of God, that he was born of a virgin mother, I'm guessing?
Well, let's just look at it this way. There are several different people around the world who supposedly were born of a virgin. So we have Alexander the Great, we have the Buddha, we have Hercules, we have Dionysius, we have Lao Tzu, and we have Pythagoras. So Jesus is now part of that pantheon. So to me, there was already a pre-existing idea that was accepted at that particular time. And the way I look at it is that they are these incredibly remarkable individuals that are able to do things that other humans seem to not be able to do. And there doesn't seem to be any way or any logic to it from a normal man-woman intercourse, that there must have been some type of supernatural intervention. And so Jesus is part of that group.
Yeah, okay. And Jesus took I guess a lot of what he was saying was from past religions. Isn't that true?
From Well, you know what? Can I kind of circle back to that? Because you were asking me like what I learned about
Yeah,
Jesus.
yeah.
And there were a number of things that when I started the research and when I finally got to starting to write the book, there were things that I learned about Jesus that I had never thought about before, and that it was very difficult to see, but then once it was like the light kind of came on and it flashed on and I was able to see it. So there were things that, are in the New Testament, but then there are things that are not in the New Testament, and I had to start to bridge the gap between the two of them. So we know from the New Testament that Jesus was born into a very pious family. And it then started to dawn on me that this particular family had a lot of connections. His family were wealthy, and they owned some type of an estate. So this estate probably had multiple arms to it. So there was some aspect of the merchant to him. There was some aspect of the cash crop or a plantation. And then it's possible or even very definite that they were involved with some type of building. So we're seeing that Jesus is coming from a family that actually was well off, but they were all business-minded people. Jesus had, and I think his family, particularly his mother, had some strong sense that Jesus was destined to do something pretty special. And then sometime between the age of 14 and 17, Jesus left home. And it appears as though he went on like a spiritual quest, or he went on a deeper spiritual learning of things. And based off of what kind of coming back to the question that you just asked, what was his influences? It appears as though there was a lot of influences that were inspired by the East. So Jesus' entire ministry and that particular practice is a very Buddhist practice. And Jesus says, I become less and the Father become more. Well, that is a very Buddhist perspective. When Jesus says the Father and I are one, that's a very Hindu perspective. When Jesus says, consider the lilies of the field, he's alluding to the Taoist perspective. And when he says, do to others as you would want them to do unto you, that literally is a direct quote from Confucius. So these ideas are not originating from the Hebrew ideas and traditions. They are coming from the outside, and Jesus is bringing it into them. There are a few other things that I started to realize when it came to Jesus's personality and some of the inspirations and some of the kind of the deep core issues that motivated him. And these are the ones that I've been able to determine. That Jesus had some kind of enlightenment experience, whether he got to see God, experience God, like Moses did, or whether he had an enlightenment experience that you would find consistent within the East. Jesus had something that was extraordinarily profound. Jesus also was beaten and robbed, and most likely he was probably beaten almost to death. At least that's the way that I've been able to recreate his story. Jesus also had some type of sexual relations that seemed to shame him quite a bit. There was also another thing that occurred to him that I'm convinced that happened to him, and that is there was something about mankind that when you kind of get into a nature of depravity, and we're kind of seeing some of that today, there's just this kind of a dark pit, and humanity is like stuck in this pit, and when you get kind of caught in that vortex, you go down with it, and you start realizing that life is meaningless and people are horrible, et cetera, et cetera. And Jesus had that type of experience. He saw the darkness of life. He saw the darkness of human beings, and that there really wasn't much that people can get outside, or can't escape this kind of spiral. So, but somehow Jesus was able to experience some greater sense of love, and was able to overcome those tendencies, those negative tendencies. And then at some point, Jesus returned back home. So those are the things that I've learned through the research of my book, and I found that those were really, really amazing. And then the other thing that I was able to determine is that Jesus, when he speaks his parables and when he speaks his aphorisms, that he is speaking from a point of view of authority and from experience, and that many of his stories and the source of his stories are autobiographical. And that was something that I have never read in any of all my research into Christianity. Jesus is speaking from a position in which his sayings have an autobiographical content to it.
Yeah. What was his family like? Did he have a brother?
Yeah, Jesus actually had 4 brothers, and he had several sisters. So one brother was James, then there's Joseph, then there's Judas or Jude, and then there is Simon. So he had 4 brothers. His mother was young. In all likelihood, she married a man who was an older man, but he was a very pious and a righteous man, and he understood business. He had a lot of connections, and he recognized that there was something about Jesus that was going to, for better or worse, change the world. And so he did whatever he could to help facilitate Jesus on that path. And his mother had a direct she was also a little bit on the psychic side, and she had very strong intuitions. But their family was wealthy, and they owned some type of estate, and they were involved with business transactions.
Yeah, I'm guessing Jesus was the oldest of them all?
Yes, he was.
Okay. And his family was wealthy when he was born?
Yes.
Or did they get wealthy as he got older?
No, they were wealthy before he was born.
Okay.
And this is what's fascinating. So when I one of the things that I did is I took all of Jesus' sayings and I broke them up into subjects and themes. So one of them was money. So money, treasure, wealth, all that. And when I broke it down into all these different themes, so food themes, the kingdom of heaven themes, money themes, etc., turns out that Jesus spoke about money the most. And when I broke that down even further, I asked, how does Jesus know about capital investment? How does he know about good labor and bad labor? How does he know about good management and bad management? How does he know about, labor disputes? There seems to be something very odd and very peculiar about a man who is supposed to be so spiritual that he can talk so freely and so eloquently about finances the way that he did. And that just made me realize that he's not just a normal carpenter, is that he came from wealth because his family experienced the very things that he's talking about.
Yeah, maybe he wasn't just a carpenter. He was also he was more of a contractor.
Well, I think the term was builder, and then that got translated into carpenter.
What did he build exactly?
Well, that's the $1 million question. My guess is, was he building houses? Was he building furniture? I don't know, but he seemed to be. Well, here's another thing, and this is again it's more philosophical, and that is there is an element to the nature of a builder, and that builder goes back to the Temple of Solomon. So there are people were considered builders who are building like essentially houses of God. And so there is that Masonic idea within that's embedded into the story of Jesus.
Now, there are some lost years in his life. Is there any record of his lost years at all? Or are they just lost years, like as far as the New Testament is concerned? Like it's not mentioned in there, but somewhere else?
Well, so this is a very important issue, and that is when Jesus dies, it's somewhere in the 30s, 30, 35, somewhere around there. And the scholars have been able to determine that the first gospel, which was Mark, was written around the year 70. So we're looking at somewhere between a 40 and a 35, 40-year time span between the death of Jesus and the beginning of the gospel tradition. So at that particular time, the Romans were involved with the Jews were involved with the Romans in the war, the Jewish, it's called the Jewish Wars from 66 to 70. And near the end of this cycle, the temple was destroyed. So these people are trying to understand Jesus in a very new way, because Paul was out there talking about Jesus in an abstraction, that he is the second Adam, he's the Lamb of God, he's the unblemished one, etc., etc. And there were other people that are saying, now wait, Jesus actually lived, so they're really trying to grapple with what did Jesus really do? What was going on? Because Paul really wasn't filling in all of those blanks that people wanted to ask. So when they're telling the story, they're leaving out a period from the time that Jesus was 12 to the time that he starts his ministry, and he starts his ministry, as the Gospels say, around 30. So there's an 18-year gap. Now, to the New Testament writers, that's okay, because that really wasn't relevant to the story. The story was what's relevant as Jesus is the person that is doing the things that he's doing, that has moved into this position of authority that we should all be, recognizing. Those other years, really, those formative years, are really not part of the interest of the writers. However, because I was able to identify different types of influences, you have to ask yourself, why is there an Egyptian influence? Why is there an Eastern influence? And why is there a Greek influence? So when Jesus speaks in his aphorisms, he's speaking in terms of, in the same way that the Greek philosophers would speak when they kind of develop an argument. Jesus' use of the Father, the term the Father, is also a Greek idea. Actually, from what I was able to research and find, is that it comes from the term that Pythagoras used, and he was referring to the one, meaning the source of everything, as the Father. So Jesus is using that word. So where did he pick up all of these ideas? Where did he pick up Greek rhetoric? Where did he pick up some of the Egyptian ideas? Where did he pick up the Eastern philosophical ideas? So you have to ask your question. Did Jesus actually go there and learn from people? Or was Jesus just really smart enough to be able to understand what other people have written about without ever having to go there? So there's like this universal library that Jesus was able to tap into and then was able to use. And so I was able to determine that Jesus, in all likelihood, went to the east. Now the question is did he go up to England? Did he go, to the pyramids? And everything in his sayings don't allude to anything that specific. So he never says like, when I was up there in England and I was over there by the white sands of Dover. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, hey, when I was hanging out at the pyramids, I went underneath the pyramids and, had this amazing experience. Jesus never really talks about his own experiences like the way that you and I are having a conversation right now.
Yeah.
He cloaks a lot of his experiences in his sayings. And that was a very interesting revelation for me.
So isn't there a lot of similarities between Christianity and the Egyptian religion back in the Egyptian days?
Well, there's some, the resurrection is one of them.
Yeah, didn't they worship a Jesus as well? And he was also like born on December 25th. And
Right. So see, we get into all these different types of pagan ideas. And so as Christianity is developing, it has to kind of move away from its Jewish roots, and it has to develop into a more of the Greco-Roman and the northern Mediterranean version of things. And that's a later development, but there are some elements that we're seeing that are early. And so you have to ask yourself, is this inspired by Jesus, or is this inspired by Jesus's followers who want to graft all these other ideas into their narrative? And that's what you have to ask almost all the time.
yeah, I'm curious. You spoke of his, virgin birth and how that goes back to a lot of famous people. Where did that idea originally come from? Did Jesus say Mary was a virgin? Did it come from his mouth, or did it come from was it somebody else's saying?
Well, I think that this is one of the things that happened after Jesus died. And we find this in one of the letters that still survives, and it's a first century letter. And that is, after Jesus died, a number of his disciples, and some of those, so if you kind of think about this for a second, in like when you get into computers, you have, point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, right? So, Jesus is, let's just say Jesus and his initial followers are Jesus 1.0. And then those followers go out and they tell they tell those stories to, these new people, and they become 2.0. Well, Paul is down there at 2.0, and then his followers are at 3.0, okay? Mm-hmm. So we're looking at things that are now being told through story. And we don't know exactly how accurate all the stories are at the 1.0 point of view. We know what things are when they get to 2.0 or 3.0 or even 4.0. We're starting to see something has developed. And it took almost 15 to 20 years before the first writing about Jesus occurred. And that was through Paul. And Paul never met Jesus. I mean, he says he did because he got, knocked off of a donkey. But he never had any direct experience with Jesus per se. Now, it's possible that he did have some early contact with Jesus because he hated the Christian message and he was out persecuting them. So maybe he was one of those Pharisees that was constantly attacking Jesus, but he never says that. Paul never says that he had that type of experience, but it could be cloaked.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think like, how would people know that he was a virgin birth? Like, where would that even come from? How would people know that?
Well, this kind of goes back to some of the mythology of both the Near East and the Greco-Romans, well, the Greeks. There are Greek concepts of virgin births. When you go back into the Near East, one of the first pieces of literature, and this is important because writing is an invention. So when was it first invented and what were they writing about? And writing kind of came about to keep records and to help with military knowledge. But once it kind of got developed, then you got the poets starting to write. And there is this book called The Epic of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh, and so this is from Babylon. So we're going back, 500 years, 600 years before Jesus. And in this epic, Gilgamesh is on a quest, and his quest is to understand the nature of immortality. Because he says that his father was a god and his mother was a human. And because of this relationship, he got 60% of his DNA is divine, but there's 40%, which I don't know why it's 60-40, is human. And so he's now on this quest to find out how he gets to experience and gets to go to heaven, so to speak, after he dies. He gets to go live in the realm of the gods because he's part God. Well, there is an early version of a virgin birth, and that goes back roughly 600 years before Jesus. And that problem has persisted. How do we get into heaven? How do we get into the realms of the divine? And this is where it gets very, very fascinating. When Paul is writing his letters, Paul also, because I didn't write a book on Paul, I thought I would, but I spent a lot of time looking at Paul. And Paul likes to directly quote from other sources. And so one of his sources is the book of Enoch. The other book that he quotes directly from, and I mean directly, he plagiarizes, is the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, there is the same issue that is taking place. How does the physical body transmute itself and become a spiritual body so that it can live in the realm of the divine? And that has been the issue for eternity. How do people go through this transformation process that goes from human to divine? What is the nature of immortality? The East has a version, the Near East has a version, the Greeks have a version, the Egyptians have a version. They all had different versions of immortality. So even in the book, so here's another one of those things that I learned while I was reading the book. I had to try to understand each of those different versions of immortality because immortality is central to Christianity.
Yeah. Now,
and that question is still with us and it still plagues us today.
So Jesus said your faith can move mountains. What did he mean by that?
Well, this goes into what an entrepreneur thinks about, and this is one of those character traits that Jesus was very, very intimate with, and that is an entrepreneur has a product and he believes in the product so much that he goes out and he sells it. He goes out there and he promotes it. He's out there promoting himself. He's out there promoting his product. And whenever you take on the consciousness of believing in something so strongly that it actually changes the whole magnetic, electromagnetic, the whole cellular part of your body, and it becomes a type of reality. And so when Jesus was out ministering, he was seeing miracles, he was seeing the people, he was seeing changed lives, etc. And if he at once kind of went through a moment of doubt and confusion and that I couldn't do this, then a lot of what he was holding on to, it's almost like walking on water, he would just fail and he would fall into the water. And so it's the conviction that one has about what they're doing, and they are so strongly convinced that what they're doing changes the way they see things and what they do. And they're always looking for opportunities to find so that they can share what it is that they can share. And Jesus is, he's a master of that. So he would look out onto the world and he would say, hey, there's all these possibilities out there, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to go find them and I'm going to experience that and I'm going to be really excited. It is that level of faith that Jesus had in himself and then also in his ministry that he would be able to change the way people thought.
Was Jesus making money on this?
I would imagine he asked for donations. And we see that there's a couple of issues where, the disciples would come up to him and says, we don't have enough money to pay for all these, to feed all these people. Jesus says, don't worry about that, And then we see Judas, dipping his hand into that little bag of money. So people, when Jesus came up to people and people really recognized, what he was doing, they felt obliged in some way to give him something. And so I think that he was willing to accept people's money.
So did Jesus actually believe that he was the Son of God? Or do you think that...
I think that is a term that came later, but I definitely felt that Jesus, as he said, as I become less, the Father becomes more. There was something that was going on in which he was being filled up with this kind of like the divine energies and this divine magic. And the more he was just allowing that to happen, the less he was becoming human. But in the way this tends to work is that the more that happens, the more human you become. So Jesus was actually activating all of those dormant possibilities deep within the human potential.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. What about his resurrection? How was he able to pull that off?
Well, I think that when you go back and you read the different literature on this particular subject, there are some that said Jesus didn't experience any pain. There are some that say Jesus didn't die on the cross. And then there is the Christian version that says that he died and that he was resurrected. Okay, so again, I think that there is a technology that is deep embedded into the universe that deals with some technology that refers to resurrection, and that Jesus was able to understand that, and that there's probably just a few people, Jesus being one of them, that was able to understand that issue and actually apply it. At the same time, I think while Jesus was in the East, and when you read some of the stories about the gurus and those who are enlightened, they are able to manage their body in such a way that they can control their breathing, they can control their heart rate, they control all those autoimmunic kind of, issues that the body, when you are, you never think about how to digest your food. You don't think about how to breathe. You don't think about how to move your hands. It's just all part of the process deep within the brain that's just doing all this stuff automatically. And so part of the Eastern techniques is to try to manage those functions. And I believe that Jesus was able to do that. So, it's possible that he went into a very deep state in which he just slowed his heart way down. We read this in the autobiography of a yogi, in which he looks as though he's dead, but he really isn't.
Yeah. And
so maybe that's what he did. I don't know, that then maybe it isn't. Maybe there was this divine intervention, because Jesus became so powerful and so enlightened and so imbued with divine energies that the divine energies never die anyway. And so the fact that his mortal body died, it doesn't mean that his spiritual body didn't die. And when I was in the East, and I went to a monastery, and I was talking to one of the monks there, and he said that their headmaster, when he died, his body didn't decay for years, like 10 years. So it stayed in a state of kind of this animated state.
How long was Jesus around after his resurrection?
I think the days vary. So there's this idea that he rose on Pentecost. So from the time that he died to the time the Pentecost happened, you read in the book of Acts, I'm going to say that, what is that, a couple of months, maybe 3 months? Okay. It didn't seem like it lasted a long time, but then again, there was a period of time that it lasted. So when you read those after crucifixion events, we're seeing Jesus, going up to the Sea of Galilee. We're seeing him walking on the road to Emmaus, etc.
Do you think he really walked on water?
Yes.
So how do you think he was able to pull that off?
Well, I think that there is an electromagnetic component to water, and there's an electromagnetic component to the human body, and Jesus was able to polarize those. So you have a negative and positive charge. So I think he was able to do that. At least that I had a dream in which that was revealed to me.
Yeah, do you think he got a hold of ancient technology then that we still haven't found today?
Yeah, we would say that. See, there's several different parts to all of this. So in the Gospel of Thomas, you're going to see a very philosophical understanding of which Jesus is the author, or at least it is assumed that he is the author. But I know that there were other people that wrote and added to the Gospel of Thomas. But Jesus is actually at the heart of it. So we're going to look at things from an intellectual point of view. And so the Gospel of Thomas really kind of directs us towards that. It's a little bit like Japanese koans. But then there's the whole other side, and you're raising that, and that is, how do you do these spiritual feats? It's not just an intellectual exercise anymore. I mean, you're actually going out there and doing it. And there is a woman right now that is exploring that. Her name is Carolyn Corey, and her video is called Superhuman, and we're looking at what humans are capable of doing. So there are things out there. There are dormant talents within us, and there are skills within us, but we have to unlock all those, and we have to kind of understand what the order is on how to activate all those. And unfortunately, Christianity did not reveal those secrets. And in the Gospel of Thomas, as I mentioned, they point to a philosophical understanding of things, but they still didn't unleash or unlock any of those deeper secrets. So I even think that because of that, there must be some other things that Jesus was teaching that didn't get into the Gospels. And it's not just a matter of, I believe in Jesus, I believe in God, and God will make this happen. Obviously, there is an element of that, but I think there's even something deeper.
Now, did Jesus ever mention any ancient civilizations or ancient technology or even aliens?
No, he didn't. In the Gospels, we don't see any of that, but we do see that he encounters angels on a regular basis. We know that there's the transfiguration that happened up there on the mountain, and it was from those encounters that I asked myself, did Jesus have any of those types of experiences before he started his ministry? Because the ministry is, what we're seeing is the last 3 years of his life. So I felt that there must have been an enormous amount of things that were happening to Jesus on a metaphysical and a paranormal level that were occurring during those missing years. And that when he finally got to the ministry, I think all of that got accentuated and accelerated.
You think maybe he was getting a hold of some kind of peyote or something?
This is a very interesting idea. It would not surprise me, and this is going back with John Allegro, who was one of the first to translate the Dead Sea Scrolls. It would not surprise me that Jesus had some type of hallucinogenics that he was exposed to. The most important thing is that when you get into that type of experience, other things show up and it gives you insight to certain things. And those are the types of things that Jesus is not talking about. So Jesus is more pragmatic, and there's a little bit of kind of philosophical element to the Gospels. Particularly when you get into the kingdom of heaven sayings, but there doesn't seem to be a direct correlation between what Jesus is saying and what you can experience with psilocybin.
All right. I want to take a step back a little bit and go back to when he was born. What do you think the three wise men and the story of the three wise men mean? There was also another example of, I guess I have to look at my notes here. A Pharisee named Judas, along with his disciples, stormed Galilee villages and towns, massacring other children and stuff. That was happening around his birth too, wasn't it? Were they after him?
Yeah. So we have a number of things that are going on. And so now we're getting into the kind of the historical context. And this is a very, very rich and exciting time. In fact, the more I read about it, the more I realized the Gospels are not pointing to any of these issues. If they are, they've minimized the whole thing. So let's just kind of get into a little bit of the context here. The Romans were the kings. They were in charge. And they would always send out, or they would have people who were either direct governors of particular territories, or they allowed the people or a king in a particular territory to run that country for the Romans. And the Romans were interested in two primary things. They were interested in peace, meaning they didn't want any uprising, and two, they wanted to tax people. And so King Herod ended up becoming the king of the Jews, and he was half Arab, and he ended up marrying the daughter of one of the high priests who was he was kidnapped, and he was held in somewhat ransom in Medo-Persia. Mm-hmm. So the Jews didn't recognize Herod the Great as a legitimate king because he wasn't a full-blooded Jew. But he ended up marrying a very important daughter of who was the high priest. He was the high priest. Anyway, that was one of his wives. He had 9 other wives, and so Herod ended up having all these children. And these children, according to history and Josephus, some of them were extraordinarily competent, and Herod was paranoid. And so he felt that his sons were going to try to usurp his power. So he ended up having them killed. The son of his wife, who was the daughter of the high priest, who was in exile, he had him killed too because the Jews liked him more than Herod. So here we have the king of the Jews killing off his family, his siblings, because he's paranoid that they're going to take over. So what happens is those who were kind of the incompetent ones, after Herod dies, they become the king. Well, they're incompetent. So they just run things into the ground, and the Romans decide, time to bring in our own people and have them run the country. Well, when they did that, that also meant that they were going to instill or enact a census on everybody. So the census was a way of registering people so that they can pay taxes to the Romans. Well, there was a particular Jew by the name of Judas the Galilean, and he was a Pharisee, and he felt that this was a sacrilegious act. There were other sacrilegious acts, but this was one of them. And he felt that anybody who was going to acquiesce to the Romans and this Roman governor and get registered for a tax was no longer considered a Jew, a free Jew. And so because you acquiesced your freedom, he felt that therefore he was justified to go in and slaughter all these people. So he went on this rampage and killing all these people. Well, it just so happens that when you read the Gospels, one, we're seeing that Herod slaughtered all the innocents because he was paranoid that there would be somebody like Jesus that was going to show up. Let me get to that later. But anyway, there's no direct evidence that Herod was doing that. He was interested in killing his own family, which is what he did. But then once his family, one of his sons became king, Antioch, I can't remember his name. I'm sorry. Anyway, the Romans realized that he can't run anything, so they brought in their governor and they brought in this tax. Well, because Judas the Galilean was on this rampage, we're starting to see people fleeing. So lo and behold, we're seeing that Jesus's family is on the run. You know, they're getting counted for the census, and then from there they're moving into Egypt. Well, it doesn't take much to realize that the very area that is being overrun by Judas the Galilean and his band of followers, and there was a big band of them that were out there killing all these people, that they were causing all this mayhem. It made a lot of sense that you would have a lot of refugees on the run and fleeing. Well, it just so happens that according to the gospel story that Jesus is born at this particular time. So now we get into this other issue, and that is things have gotten so desperate for the Jews that the only way that they can get outside of this desperate situation, and historically, is that there would always be this Savior that would show up, whether it was Moses or whether it was Noah, etc., whether it was King David. There was always somebody that God would bring into the situation that would rectify the problem, the enslavement, the Philistines, the Watchers, all of that. Mm-hmm. And they felt that this was the Jews felt, and it was just pervasive across the whole board and the whole spectrum, is that this was a ripe time for God to show up, and the Messiah was going to bring peace. Well, the Messiah to the Jews means one thing, but the Messiah to the Christians means something different. And so the Christians elevated this Messiah into the Son of God concept. That's not the way it's supposed to be. The Jews totally flat out reject that. The Messiah is one who is anointed. It just means anointed by God, and his agency is going to restore Israel to original condition. Not mankind, just Israel.
Yeah, so if they were waiting for a Messiah to come and lead them out of this turmoil, why did they turn on him and have him crucified?
Right, because that goes back to this concept that I was kind of touching upon earlier, and that is the Old Testament supposedly is all of this prophecy, so it's all alluding to what's going to happen in the future. And so once Jesus died, a number of his followers were looking into the Old Testament. They were scouring all the pages. And they find him in Isaiah, and they find him in Jeremiah, and they find him in the book of Jonah, and all these other prophets, and they start picking and cherry picking all these ideas, and then they put it all together and say, see, look, all of the prophets were pointing to Jesus as the one. And so there was this concept at that time that there would be one that would be a suffering servant who would be the sacrifice for the Jews. And so Jesus seemed to have fit that bill. So they just went, see, all the prophecies point to Jesus as the one.
So what do you think after all your research? Do you think he was the one?
Oh, I think that, every epoch, and maybe, during the 2,000 years of these processions, that new ideas come into the world. And it appears to me that there is a very strong mystical element that was occurring at the time of Jesus. And we have a particular man who's deeply inspired by, the Father, as he said. And so this is the perfect storm, so to speak, in which you bring all these elements together, in which there's this new epoch, there's the new idea, the old is going away. As Jesus said, the old has to go. He uses the old wine and wineskins, right? So the old wine and the old wineskins have to go. You can't put the new wine into the old wineskins, otherwise you'll destroy it. So you need new wine and new wineskins. Jesus is referencing that. He's referencing these new times that are coming. And he's showing people how to live more integrated lives. And so his teachings, his general practice and his general teachings are to, do not judge, don't condemn, turn the other cheek, give your shirt, walk the extra mile, love your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule, right? That words have power, be brave and courageous, all those kind of things. Jesus is bringing in this kind of a new way of living your life. And it wasn't necessarily to honor all of those old traditions that the Jews were so accustomed to. So we have Jesus was up against the high priests, and he was up against the temple. Jesus was saying, you're the temple of God. So if you're the temple of God, there's no need for that temple over there. So he was really kind of challenging the status quo on many religious points of view.
Yeah. Do you think we're due for another
type of Jesus?
Yeah.
I think so. It's a 2,000-year cycle that maybe there's, that's why there's a lot of people speaking of terms like avatars now. And then there's also people speaking that Jesus is going to return. So we have Jesus as the suffering servant on the one hand, and then he's supposed to come back as the judge, riding his white horse on the other.
Yeah. So when you speak of return, do you mean like a reincarnation?
Well, it seems though in the New Testament, when you get with the book of Revelation, that there is a direct manifestation of Jesus returning to throw Satan into the fire, right, the lake of fire, and that Jesus is going to reign for 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. So there's that whole peaceable kingdom concept. That he's the judge that's going to get rid of the wickedness that didn't happen the first time, but it's going to happen the second time.
Well, we definitely live in interesting times. I think.
Yeah. It's very similar to what Jesus is going through, right, or what Jesus went through. There's a lot of turmoil, whenever you get into this whole social unrest and you have traditions, and the traditions are now being challenged, and we're seeing that in our country today, people get really upset. And so there's three basic responses that occurred at that particular time. And Jesus is out there fomenting change. And one is people became more Jewish, right? They really kind of went back to the old-time religions, and they became more devout. The other reaction was to become more Roman and embrace Greco-Roman ideals. And so Greco-Roman ideals are, the body, the man is the measure of all things, pleasure, wrestling, fighting, chariots, gymnasium, all that kind of stuff that you associate with the Greeks in the first Olympic kind of thing. And then there was the other groups of people that were they were stepping in both worlds. They had feet in both worlds. So they had a little bit of the traditional ideas and they embraced a little bit of the Greco-Roman ideas.
Yeah.
And Jesus was just kind of like out there saying, hey, you know, here are some things to pay attention to. You know, inside of you is the kingdom of heaven. You know, the kingdom of heaven is in your midst. And this is very new stuff for that particular time and for that particular people. It's very odd. And he also talks about the self, the nature of the self. So
Yeah, you have to wonder if he wasn't more of an evolved, like if he had a more of an evolved consciousness than what we have today.
well, I'm going down that road. So instead of saying he's the Son of God, I'm much more interested in saying this man picked up and learned all of these techniques from all these different sources and blended them together into his ministry. And look what kind of person that he was. Look at the type of person he was. He knew how to perform miracles. He knew how to dodge fights. He knew how to manage his body. He knew how to walk on water, heal the sick. And then he had everything about him was, let me show you how you do this. So whenever he went out into the world, he was showing his disciples how to do things. What happens when you get confronted by people who don't like you and threaten you? Do this. What's it like when you walk into some, village and people are willing to listen to what you have to say? What do you offer them? What do you give them? So, I mean, he was a man who was all about show and tell, and he was always being very authentic about everything that he did. And he was like kind of a man who personified wisdom and grace and integrity and honesty.
All right. So let's go back to something you mentioned earlier that I wanted to touch up on, but I figured I'd get to it later on in the show. I want to talk about how you said he was having sexual encounters.
Mm-hmm.
Now, was he married?
That is my belief that he was married to Mary Magdalene.
So did he have girlfriends before then?
It's possible, most likely, yes.
Did he have children?
It seems like he had. It's possible that he had an offspring from one encounter he had before he was married, and it seems as though he also had. This is all. I mean, there's nothing in here in the New Testament that says any of this, but you have to kind of read a lot in between the lines and say, what are the possibilities of these types of things to occur? And one of the ways that I was looking at this, and that is when you read the Dead Sea Scrolls and you read about the Essenes, there was this one practice that seemed to be consistent, and that is this particular group of people, these Essenes, they believed this. And if there was somebody that came in and believed the same thing that you did and then realized, oh, I don't believe this anymore, then that person was just trashed, just thrown over the coals, thrown under the bus, whatever you want to call it. And they were really mean and vicious about it. And then I started looking at the New Testament and I was saying, I'm seeing the same pattern here. How come Mary Magdalene is being trashed? Why is she considered a whore? Why is she considered as harlot? Why is she considered, or why is she so minimized? So there was something about the nature of this argument that the Jews had, that if you're not with us, you're against us, and if you're against us, then we're just going to trash you. We're seeing these weird kind of relationships also in the Gospels. So we're looking at Jesus as being elevated, his mother is being elevated up to this godlike, status. We're seeing his family completely minimized. And then we're seeing other people within this group of Christians who are elevated up really high and those who are denigrated. So we're seeing the same pattern. So I had to ask myself, if I'm seeing this pattern, why would they be doing this to Mary Magdalene? And it seemed to me that she was a very, very bright woman. And if she was married to Jesus, she had to have had the same kind of intellect as Jesus, because I don't think Jesus would, accept kind of a very soft-spoken kind of a woman. I think he was probably interested in somebody that was just as outspoken and as strong as he was. And if she was the one that I think she was, then she was rattling a lot of the men's cases and probably getting in their faces. And that's why they had to destroy her as the way they did. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of them. And plus, when you say that Jesus is the Son of God and she'd go, no, that's not the way it is, then all of a sudden you've now just set yourself up as an enemy. And I think that happened too. So now we kind of get into this concept of Jesus. Was he married? Yes, he was. I think he was married, and he was married to Magdalene, and that he had a child. And there are things about, like, the kingdom of heaven are like these little children. Seems to me that again, I go back to this idea that he is intimate with everything that he's saying, and that there's an autobiographical content to what he's saying, that when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven is like these children, that somewhere along the line he seems to recognize children, and maybe that's because he was a father. And he's looking at a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old and how they feel and how they view the world. And that, even when you kind of go into Buddhism, there's a childlike innocence about it, that we're all trying to recreate our childhood and just be open to everything and not judgmental. So, Jesus is kind of using children as an example, and I felt that example had something to do with the fact that maybe he was a father.
Do you think it's possible that Jesus was a hybrid between human and something else?
I didn't try to go down that road. I just was more interested in trying to understand Jesus from the perspective of his sayings and his actions, mm-hmm. and the social context and the historical context. So when it got into that kind of stuff, because I've been asked that, I actually did a 4-part lecture series on the Gospel of Thomas, and I was asked directly, is Jesus an alien? And my answer is I don't think so. I think that Jesus was the fulfillment of human potential. He reached a certain element of potential, what we're all capable of doing. And that's why he said, you too are capable of all this. The question is what are we willing to sacrifice to get into that same state of mind that he was? And we don't have the same esoteric kind of schools. And it's not about the head. Even though Jesus is talking, a lot of very abstract ideas, particularly you'll find these in the gospel or in the kingdom of heaven sayings, he was also about the heart, how to give, how to relate. But then there was this other side which he was able to create. He was able to perform miracles. So how did he do that? None of those ideas or none of those techniques are at all talked about. How do you do this? What do you have to do?
Yeah. So why was the Gospel of Thomas excluded from the New Testament?
I think that has to do with the ideas that they were promoting. So there are 2 types of messiahs that are being propagated roughly at the same time. So the one is Jesus died for your sins. He's the Son of God, and you have to believe in him. And the other one is that Jesus, as the Messiah, showed us the way back to God, and that we have to recognize the self, you, as the divine spark, and that we need to awaken that which is asleep within us. And those 2 ideas were at one point they were together. So we now refer to it as Gnosticism, but at the time in the first century, the Gnostics and the the proto-Christians, the ones that we would recognize today, they were a family. They were kind of like holding hands. They were part of this bigger thing. But there was a rift because of the theology And in the 2nd century, it really started to widen and separate. And before that, there was just kind of a fault line. And then it wasn't until the 4th century that it just became too much.
Yeah, it really is a shame that, these decisions were made for us on what we should read and what we shouldn't read.
That's correct. And so the New Testament canon is promoting a particular idea, and part of that idea, so Christianity at the time of the Nicene Council, so we're looking in the 4th century, somewhere around 313, 320, 325, somewhere right around in there, we have Constantine. He's the emperor of Rome. Rome is so big that there was no way to manage it. And so they decided that they were going to have multiple emperors. And so Constantine, well, there was going to be at one point there was multiple emperors, but then they got into fights, and then it got down to 2, and then Constantine was fighting against his rival. And Constantine ended up winning, and now he decides that there's only going to be one emperor. Christianity has multiple faces to it, and he said, we're going to get rid of all of the tension and the strife and the civil war inside of Christianity. And all you bishops, you're going to come together and you're going to agree upon what is going to be official and accepted and what isn't, because I don't want any more civil war. And that's kind of in a nutshell how we got Christianity today, is that it was based off this idea that there shouldn't be a civil war anymore and that there should be unity. And of course now, 1700 years later, I'm coming along saying, hey, look at Jesus' humanity, and that's a bad thing to look at. So I'm kind of going back to an earlier version of Christianity and using Gnosticism as a vehicle. How do we tap into our divine nature? How do you bring that out into the world? How do you incorporate, divine techniques and spiritual practices into your life? What do you do?
So looking back now on all of the research you've done, where would you say your religious belief, what would you say your religious belief is in?
My feeling is that when we talk about, like, say, the 7 chakras, and we talk about the nature of the pyramids, and we talk about what Jesus is saying, we're looking at this is hard to explain. We're looking at an early version of trying to have a greater human potential, and that we're trying to tap into all these different types of energies, whether they be physical energies or spiritual energies or planetary energies, etc., or even, with the way the East dealt with chakra systems. All of those were designed for a human being that was, let's just say, was 12 years old or 15 years old or 20 years old. Human beings now are older. So are all those techniques still valid, or are they just for a particular mindset of a person who was like a teenager, and now we get to move into a more deeper relationship? And that's how I feel, is that those were techniques, and those were stories, and those were philosophical ideas that were pointing to greater awareness, but that was what was needed at that time. But today, if we actually can embrace all those ideas, we might be able to take these things, into a much more interesting territory. And that's what I believe, is that the human potential, the human mind, the human spirit is capable of a great deal, and that all those stories were necessary for that time, and those techniques were necessary for that time to help mankind evolve. And so now, hopefully, we have been able to absorb all of those spiritual techniques and that spiritual knowledge and move us forward.
And
and that we will have outside agencies to help us.
what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that there's a lot of new information that's coming towards us that might not necessarily be human. So I think, when you get into the aliens, we're seeing that there's other forms of knowledge and there's other forms of technology and there's other forms of understanding that seem to be beyond human abilities. Or maybe not. Maybe those are human abilities that we just haven't reached that stage yet. And so it still seems as though they're magic. But that's what I mean, is that there might be, alien presence here that are now trying to help us, further us along. And we no longer need the teenager or high school kind of curriculum. We need more of the college curriculum.
Yeah, and then we need that newcomer, right, to teach us the new way.
Well, that's the interesting thing. So right now we're seeing, the concepts of an avatar showing up more and more. And is this kind of the paradigm where people are thinking, is there an avatar for us? Now, on the other side, the flip side of this, the Christians are looking to the Antichrist as the one who's going to bring peace to the world. And he's just, he's a false Messiah. So you have these kind of interesting ideas where there's the avatar concept, and then there is this Antichrist concept. But we seem to be moving in a closer relationship to where this becomes more and more real. And this is, to me, it's on one hand, it's very exciting, but on another hand, we're kind of seeing what's going on in our society today, and we're seeing a lot of destruction that's taking place. So it's very unsettling.
Yeah, it seems like we're in a place that we haven't been in quite a while.
No, I agree with you. And, what do you do?
I don't mean to drag you off of the subject of your book, but where do you see all of this in relation to Revelation and where we are today?
Well, first of all, we're in an extreme state of chaos. Our institutions are being questioned. Our traditions are being questioned. And we seem to be being affected by groups of people that no longer abide or embrace concepts that, what does it mean to be an American? So we have that element going on right now. And so we're all being agitated, and maybe these are the beginnings of the birth pangs for a new birth. So, and I don't know what it looks like. I really don't. I mean, part of holding civilization together is that there is institutional stability. And on one hand, that's very good because it allows people just to kind of live normal lives. But in unstable times, now there's a franticness that's taking place. And maybe this is the franticness of change that is necessary. But there might be change both that is positive and both that is negative. Again, I think that, I've talked with a number of people, and I'm just amazed at how many people are tapping into or listening to like divine spirit guides, their channelers, etc. I mean, there seems to be this burgeoning and awakening of all this spirituality, and a lot of it is directed towards the outside of ourselves. There's a spiritual entity called so-and-so, and they are telling us that this is the way things are, so there's a type of an avatar in that. But, is there
even disclosure?
And then you have that whole nature of the disclosure. Exactly. So there is something going on. It is very tumultuous.
What do you think I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. What do you think the consequences of aliens landing on Earth would have on the religion and the Bible and the Christian faith?
Well, on one hand, it would be very, very unsettling to a lot of people because the aliens are not looking like typical angels, and they're probably not looking like a typical God, and they're looking very different. So on one level, things would be very unsettling and difficult. And for others, it is, the concept, I'm right. I've always felt that there's other intelligence that are out there in the universe, and here they are.
Yeah.
So now the question becomes, are you here to help us, or are you here to destroy us? Where are you in this spectrum?
Yeah. Where am I?
No, well, that's the question is when it comes to the aliens, where are the aliens on this spectrum? Are you for us or are you against us? Are you here to take our resources, or are you here to help us transform ourselves? So,
Well, hopefully they're here to help us transform, and then wouldn't that be another second coming?
yes, yes,
Nobody said that Jesus had to return as a human, right?
exactly. And we've seen him that he's like, when you read the book of Revelation, we see him, as this light energy, and there's flames coming out of his eyes. It's like this really amazing kind of picture of this person, and it doesn't look human. I mean, somewhat, but there's this whole other aspect to him that is non-human.
Yeah, I think if aliens wanted to destroy us, they'd just do what they're doing now and just leave us alone. We'll take care of destroying ourselves.
Edgar Mitchell said that. He says, look, I know that there's aliens out there, and if they wanted to destroy us, they would have done it already.
It probably wouldn't take them very long. Oh, man, it's just such crazy times we live in. I got a question for you, just on another, just a side question. Do you know if they've gotten any of Jesus's DNA?
Wouldn't that be remarkable?
They cloned him.
Well, okay, so here's the question. I was asked this once, and I said, well, remember, Jesus had a family, so he had brothers and sisters, so what's their DNA? Because it's coming from that DNA. And if I do believe that he was married to Mary Magdalene, and that they had at least one child, there would be, his DNA would be in his offspring. So there has to be some evidence of Jesus, at least from the way I'm thinking right now. There has to be some element of Jesus's DNA. Now the question is how pure is it, or is it how diluted is it?
Right, that Shroud of Turin or whatever.
You're right, and so I look at that going, oh my God, look, there's all this light energy that just emanated straight out of this shroud and left a shadow, like you would see the same kind of shadow of a victim at Hiroshima. Their shadow is embedded into the side of a wall or on the concrete. And so we're seeing something. To me, it seems like we're seeing something very similar.
Yeah, like
there was this light energy that's not coming from outside, it's coming from inside, and it's projecting out.
Do you think that was his?
I have no reason not to believe that, because I do believe in the nature of the power of light. And so I think that there is a philosophical idea about that, but I also think that there is actually a reality about that. So, and Jesus was aware of it, and he experienced it, and he manipulated it, and he used it.
Yeah, he was able to tap into it, that's for sure.
Exactly. And I think that's the way I see Jesus, is that he made himself a living sacrifice, and he knew a lot of the things that you and I are talking about. He knew how to perform miracles. He knew he had a sharp mind. He was a genius, and he knew how to use spiritual energies in a practical manner and also in a kind of a paranormal manner. That's awesome. And that's a really evolved human being.
So is there anything you want to leave us with?
We all have incredible potential within us. And the biggest obstacles to that are our own limitations and our own kind of toxic emotions. And so Jesus was very clear. He had very definite emotions, and he knew how to use his emotions and his intellect and his heart as a bit of like a triad to affect the changes that he was hoping to affect, and that he stepped out in faith to affect these changes.
Awesome. David,
And he's somebody to look at. To me, he's still somebody to look at.
yeah, and I'm sure that there's been others since.
Well, I think if you go to the East, there are a lot. It's just that we in the West have a different perspective. The Western mind is just that. It's about the mind. And so we're interested in understanding reality and the material world through science. And we've kind of gotten away from the heart and light. But it's just part of the mind that we are exploring at the moment.
Yeah, and I think a lot will come to light if we can, unearth a little bit more of our Earth's history and understand that we probably did have extreme technology, even beyond what we have now, tens of thousands of years ago, that is being suppressed.
I used to believe, I grew up with Chariots of the God, so I was completely fascinated by that whole concept. And now when we're starting to see the skeletons coming out and they're 15 and 20 feet tall, you have to wonder about that too.
Yeah, that's true.
It's just crazy. I mean, there's so much information out there. And what I found is that we can all get titillated by all that kind of stuff, but ultimately you still have to go through your own process. We're working out our own salvation. We're finding our own God within ourselves. We're finding that there's more to life than what we see.
And that's the key, I think, where we are as individuals on the inside. Nobody can judge us more than ourselves. And, maybe when we move on, we are our own judgment.
And I think I go back to what Paul said, and that is we become co-creators. I think we can become co-creators right now, just like Jesus. We just have to get to the point where we recognize that there's something bigger outside of ourselves that we want to participate in. And then you start participating in it, and then that transforms you into it.
David, you want to tell everybody where they can find you?
Oh, fantastic. So I'm David Collis. My book is called Interviewing Jesus the Man. You can get that on Amazon. It is both a physical book, it is an ebook, and it is an audio book. And my website is my website is davidcollis.com, and my Facebook page is David C. Collis. I also have, I'm also the host of Nightlight with David Collis, and I'm on Facebook.
Do you have a YouTube channel?
No, I don't, but the woman that is hosting my show has all that up, and so there are YouTube archives of my show on barbaradalong.com.
barbaradalong.com?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Well, we really appreciate you coming on the show. It's a fascinating conversation, and maybe we can get you on again at a later date.
Yeah, let's do it. Michael, thank you so much.
You got it. And we'll be right back right after this. And welcome back to Conflict Radio. We're just going to go ahead and wrap it up today. That was an interesting show, and I really don't have much to say about it. Everybody, do your own homework, and you figure out who Jesus is. It's not up to anybody to decide, but you. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found us on YouTube. We are the Conflict Radio Network on YouTube. There's a few different Conflict Radios out there, I guess, but we are the Conflict Radio Network. You can find us on YouTube. You can also find us online if you're ever confused. Go to www.conflictradio.net and you'll get links to our YouTube channel straight from there. So that's always a good place to start. It's a pretty neat website. We're putting a lot of work into it. A lot of neat things to be found there. You can also listen to us on iHeartRadio podcast, Apple iTunes podcast, Spreaker, Spotify, all the normal podcast catchers. And until Thursday, we'll be batten down the hatches and be safe.